Hi, everybody. Good morning. How are you all doing? Yeah, what? Hopefully you all had a chance to start reading Shibaburo. On Friday, you're going to be discussing the book a bit, and you'll be working on your Essay 1 theses. So do get the readings done so you can have that in time to have the week, Friday and Saturday, work on those. It's due on Sunday, if you'll notice, on the syllabus. And I'll show you on Thursday how to turn those in, and I'll put up a worksheet that shows you how to turn it in. It's on a site on Moodle called Turn It In, so it's all online. That's the way I'll be taking the essays on Sunday. Any questions? Yeah, Joe. It's reading questions, but yeah, they're due today. Yes. So if you have it, sometimes students sometimes don't do things. Yeah. So yes, they are due today, and if you haven't started the book and you don't have the questions done, that's not good. Hopefully you have a chance to get those done. Yeah. Lauren? Yeah. Let me think. So for today, that's fine. Just shoot me an email, and I will take those. But hopefully you have them with you in some form you can look at. I'm going to ask you guys to talk about the book a little bit today and see how we're doing on that.
Just to be clear, those reading questions are submitted?
They'll be submitted either by email or in hard copy today.
Okay, everyone just hard copy or email David. Please don't email your assignments because
In general.
Stay organized with all that checking out. I realize it's an extra effort to print it, but I do appreciate those extra efforts. And if you don't have it today, you can turn it in on Thursday. Is that all right?
Sure. Yeah. I think I can go ahead and write on. I can write on the syllabus. I can write on the syllabus. Just I can write bring to class hard copy just to make sure that we're all on the same page on that from now on. Okay? Yeah. Are you Natalie?
Yes.
Yes, Natalie.
I'm going to the hard copy today. Would you prefer to email it to you today and then bring in the hard copy on Thursday? Or
Just bring it on Thursday. Yeah. These are sort of half for you because if you read the books, if you read the book and you go with these questions, you'll have some idea of what I'm asking you to focus on. But I would like you to do them and to know that you've done them. So Thursday is fine if you don't have them hard every day. Thursday is fine. Okay? Okay. So let's talk about the last days of the shogunate. It's quite a topsy-turvy moment in Japan. Let's take a step back and just make sure we recall a bit about the end of last class. We talked about some ideologies that were a bit confrontational, a bit conflictual, a bit heterodox. And they were not necessarily persecuted for their ideas, these figures, but they had ideas that we, I think, can see where they have the sort of seeds of dissent. Does anyone recall a figure named Motori Norinaga from last class? Does that name ring a bell? A little bit? All right. An ideology called Kokugaku, or national studies. Does that ring a bell? Can anyone give me just a brief idea of what that ideology was promoting? Is it Cash? Yeah. Yeah, right. So it's about Japanese identity, a separate, distinct identity, right? Having their own language, their own culture, their own history, and being overly cynicized. And he's against this, right? Peter? Exactly, right? So finding the original Japan and trying to peel back all the Chinese influence and give Japan a chance to be Japan again, right? So very good, very, very well done. So we talked about sort of how he got to this. He read through the Kojiki, which is Japan's first written history of itself, written in Chinese, to try and find this. He at his school, his school called Suzumiya has about 500 students over the course of his life. So he's pretty influential, right? And these ideas are quite influential beyond just his circle of friends or that kind of thing. So a few key ideas I want to make sure that we have as we move forward. The emperor is a divine being, right? The emperor has inherited his throne from the original founder of Japan, who himself was the great grandson of the sun goddess, which is part of the story written in this Kojiki, this text. The Chinese mind, which you guys talked about a second ago, and also this sort of ability to have emotional attachment to things, right? A very Japanese aesthetic. Rivers, sakura blossoms, the wind, these kinds of things. He wants to get back to that. And again, the big idea for him is that the emperor perhaps is the heart of Japan, right? And that what's in place now in terms of Japan's government doesn't quite make sense. So let's talk about a student of his who takes the ideas even further. This is a figure named Hirata Atsutane, who is also a scholar, also a Confucian scholar originally, but he's very interested in the ideas that Motoi Norinaga draws from the Kojiki-den. He's very interested in this new idea of the emperor being the center of Japan. And he has lots more students. He writes more texts for a broader audience, and so people are drawn to him perhaps even more than Norinaga. And for that reason, he's much more famous. He is so famous that, if you'll recall, the school in Mito, right, another domain that was having some themselves sort of some controversial ideas, they think about hiring him to become their next major scholar, but he has some ideas which they also don't necessarily agree with, so they don't actually hire him. But they're definitely in touch and in contact and communication. Yeah, and tell me your name? Derek, yeah. So great questions. We're actually going to get to that today. But yes, we're definitely talking about a time of change that parallels the U.S. Civil War, also the Opium War, and Japan's having to figure out isolation or not isolation as a way forward. Thanks, Derek, for that question. So Atsutane is unable eventually to join directly the Mito school. He's very controversial. He writes a book, as the title I think shows. It's about how the emperor, in fact, should be in charge of Japan, since it has been since the beginning of time for Japan. And this book gets him exiled, right? So it's a controversial book with very clear ideas. These ideas, some of them are taken up again by this school in Mito. So let's talk now about the school in Mito briefly. If you'll recall, Mito is a domain. It's this big blue domain here. It is a domain held by the daimyo, so a feudal lord, but who is also the head of the cadet branch of the shogun's family, the family Tokugawa. So if the shogun failed to produce an heir, this other trunk, right, would provide the next shogun. So they can't govern unless there is this rare occurrence of not having someone to fill the shogunate. So out of power, they devote a lot of energy, right, to thinking, reading, writing histories. I discussed last class how they put a lot of energy into writing the Great History of Japan, the Dainihonshi, and which again involves going back to Japan's ancient roots, trying to find again the real Japan. And by the 1800s, they've been reading very carefully the texts of Norinaga, we just talked about, of Atsutane as well. And those ideas have become part of their worldview, their view of how Japan should move forward. So the bottom line is Japan should be led by the emperor and not by the shogun, even though these people are tied by blood to the shogunate. In the 1850s, the daimyo of Mito is Tokugawa Nariaki. He makes a bold move to hire as the head scholar of his domain a figure named Aizawa, sometimes as pronounced, this is not sure today, Seshisai or Yasushi, and he's in your textbook, so you can go look him up there, again, if you'd like, as the leader of the Mito school. And again, he's taking a lot of ideas we've already talked about, and he's sort of building off these ideas and trying to develop some policy ideas for Japan. because the cousin of the shogun, Nariaki, has these ties, they believe that he can help perhaps to reform the shogunate, right, by giving these cool, new, more progressive ideas about a new Japan to the shogunate. The key text that is written by Aizawa Yasushi is called Shinron, or New Theses, and it's a very critical text, right? A text that, had he not been working at the time for the daimyo Mito, probably would have gotten him put in jail. So it's very critical. The basic themes are that the West is a bad influence upon Japan, even though the Dutch studies, that's very limited. That if the West comes to Japan, it will destroy Japan and destroy its culture. And perhaps more important than that is the fact that the shogunate is unprepared to handle this future potential Western threat. He points to the shogunate and the samurai class as a whole and all of their flaws, right? They spend too much money. They go to brothels too much. They aren't reading the text they're supposed to be reading. They aren't responsible. They don't respond to the problems of the peasants and the craftsman class. They're too preoccupied with looking nice and wearing nice clothes. So all of these critical elements are laid forth in this text. So, critical shogunate. Again, this is a controversial thing to do, but above that, he even goes above and beyond to argue that the emperor should, in fact, be the unifying symbol of Japan, so that perhaps the shogunate can stay around or not, but that the emperor needs to become the most important symbolic figure, at least, for a unified Japan to be able to be strong enough to face the West. The West is coming, and I want to discuss that next. He's not wrong about the West trying to get to Japan, and this is what I think is part of why he has these views. In 1808, in Nagasaki, if you'll recall, there's a Dutch port, the only port where we allow foreigners into Japan, the only port for Western knowledge into Japan. There is, as we recall, this Dutch ship that goes back and forth, still at this point carrying trade between China and Japan. In 1808, the world has changed quite a bit. The British have taken over a lot of Dutch colonies and settlements over in Southeast Asia in particular, and they are looking to continue to expand their own empire. So a British ship puts on Dutch colors, Dutch flags, and sails into Nagasaki Bay, right, to Dejima. What's supposed to happen in this situation is there's a whole ritual, right? Every year the Dutch ship comes, the Japanese receive them, they fire cannons to announce that they're ready for attack if there is one, and in response the Dutch fire some cannons to show that they're not threats, right? So there's a whole ritual that goes into place here. What happens in this case is nothing. They show up, they sail into the harbor, no cannons are fired. By the time that the Japanese begin to worry that this might be some sort of a problem, they're much too close to have a friendly fire exchange. So they fire their old cannons, some of which actually misfire. They haven't been updated in a long time. The British ship is able to enter the harbor with no real challenge. The next sort of backup plan of the Japanese is to have 1,000 samurai ready to go to attack if there is to defend Japan if there is an actual attack. But in reality, they're only able, when the British land, to summon about 100 samurai. The story doesn't end very poorly. The British decide not to stay, not to fight. They decide to leave without a fight. They're a bit worried about what might happen if they, as one ship, try to take on Japan. More forces do, over the course of a couple of days, arrive, and so that they leave. The British leave. Everything's okay. But this critical moment, it showed that the samurai in Nagasaki were unprepared. They were unable to handle a Western attack, even a simple one that might have been easy to avert. the magistrate, who is the person in charge of Nagasaki, he commits seppuku, or ritual suicide, because he's very embarrassed. But beyond that, the shogunate becomes quickly aware that it really is unable to defend Japan. So, thinking back to Aizawa Teshisai, or Aizawa Yasushi, this figure, his vehement criticism of the shogunate for being unprepared and weak, he's thinking about this incident in particular. He's also thinking about what's happening elsewhere. So when he writes this text, almost right away, right, he's able to, his lord, the daimyo of Mito, sends this book to the shogunate, who decides to enact a law to expel any foreign ship in Japanese waters. So if a ship does go beyond Dejima towards Nagasaki itself, they will be expelled. Over time, and as we'll see today, this policy is going to be relaxed and changed because of a fear the Japanese are having of the Western powers. So in 1842, a new law is passed, and this law will allow the Japanese to give fuel and shelter, provisions, and safe departure, so not to be fired upon, to Western ships. And then 1845, sort of in response to this as well, and trying to sort of find a way to mitigate, right, to compromise between the forces against the West and those that are worried about the West being too powerful. They try to begin to make their defenses in Nagasaki and also in Fukuoka and in the bay near Edo much stronger in case there is an attack. So those of you who have had classes on East Asia before, or world history before, what's happening in the 1830s and 40s that might make the Japanese rethink their policy of firing on all Western ships that approach? Anyone know? Is it Ross?
Yeah.
What's that?
You mentioned it, but the Opium War.
The Opium War, right? So the Opium War is happening, right, at this point in time. I might actually skip ahead to show you a slide of that. There, right? So not once, but twice, the great country of China is faced with British aggression, and then the British aggression turns into an actual war, right? And each time that the Chinese lose this war, they receive, they're forced to pay reparations that are much larger than what they could possibly pay, so they go into debt. The country as a whole is crippled, and also in the end, the goal was to stop opium being sold to China from British, Pakistan, and India, from that area, and now it is being sold illegally in China. There's no more break on that. So this was a big failure, right? And so Japan is aware of this, and so this is part of what's in the background here. Okay, I'm going to go back a few slides to what's happening. The United States and also Russia have been trying to get to Japan for a long time. Japan is a good spot to stop over for whaling vessels who want to get more coal for their ships, to get drinking water, to get lemons, other important sources for for navies and these kinds of things. So Japan has this possibility, and Russians have been trying. They keep trying to go. They send someone to Japan. A person, there may be a shipwreck. There may be just a refusal to meet the person. Each time they are rebuffed. The Americans also try, and the American ship, I think in 1837, that tries to go to Japan is destroyed. So there is this pressure, right, to open Japan to the West. The West is more and more aware of Japan's value as a port, and perhaps more than a port. And so after 2.5 centuries of very purposeful seclusion, Japan has to think about what to do next. Do they open up to the West or not? Do they fight against the West and face the fate of China, what should they do? And they are clearly unready to do those kinds of things. In 1853, a Commodore in the U.S. Navy, Commodore Matthew Perry, sails 4 ships. He's on the USS Mississippi, right, into the harbor of Edo, and he would like to change this situation and bring a new Japan-American relationship into existence. Yulia.
So what made the Japan so attractive to, why did other people want it? What did they have?
Yeah, I mean the first thing is sort of coastal access and good harbors that are safe from storms. That's kind of the main thing. The other part is that as a way to get to the continent, to get to China or to Russia, it's also a good location, right? So it's sort of a stepping stone to the continent. So it has both of those advantages. There are other things like the silk trade that are important, but they're less important. We'll see them become more important. We do know that in the 1840s and 50s, Americans in particular are being drawn into the silk trade, and they're trying to find ways to make their mark. And Japan seems to have sort of a good share of that market as well, and they would like to use Japan as sort of a courier to get them into the larger silk market. So that's also going on, and we'll see that once Japan does become a more westernized country, that it becomes one of the top silk manufacturers in the world. So they weren't wrong about that as well. But yeah, good questions. So at the arrival of Commodore Perry with his 4 ships, you have to sort of picture it first, right? Japanese don't have very nice ships. They haven't been working on ships for a long time. Their ships are mostly based on Dutch designs from the 1650s and 1660s. So Commodore Perry's arrival looks like this. Actually, this is actually a later one. So Commodore Perry, with his 4 ships, they call them black ships, right? These are big, impressive ships, steam frigates, right, that can go quite fast, and they're just really big, right? They are in the harbor. Commodore Perry manages safely to pull his first ship, the front ship, close to the harbor, and the Japanese go out to meet this ship. And he says, I'm just here with a message. I'm not going to try and go into Japan, but basically I would like to give you the option to think about allowing the U.S. to become Japan's trading partner, about opening Japan to the West. I'll give you a year, and I'll come back with more ships, bigger ships, other armed ships. So just think about it. And in the meantime, here's a letter from the President of the United States asking for you to open Japan's ports to American trade. This is a very scary moment for the Japanese. Right? The shogunate has sort of a pretty clear, I would say, ultimatum. Right? This is we talk about gunboat diplomacy. This is what this refers to this kind of moment where a weaker country is faced with the reality of war, an attack, or new diplomacy with a stronger military country. So when Perry comes back, this is a picture drawn by a Westerner, but who actually was a German figure. And if you look at the image quickly, you can sort of see perhaps that there are some stark contrasts between the Japanese and the Westerners. So it's probably hard to see, but this is Commodore Perry here. And the soldiers are here and here. So that's kind of hard to see, but can anyone sort of tell me a thing that they see about the image? Like, what about this image to you sticks out or strikes you? Or what does the image say? Or, I don't know. Look at the image, what comes to mind? Cooper, yeah.
The Japanese use a box skin and box organized. Pretty much trying with all American soldiers.
Yeah, so the idea of the box stick is very astute, right? So the Americans have very rigid, straight lines, right? And they've created a box, right, to demonstrate that they are, advanced military force, that they are advanced in sort of formation. They're there to mean business as well. What else comes to mind? Natalie?
Going off that, just like the implication that there is these honor zones, the boundaries that really exist now. They're on one hand, the mechanisms like set parameters or things kind of structure, and then also labeling them as kind of uncivilized with that, like, the basis for in, what's the word I'm looking for, next to the straight line, which means like they don't have a kind of word, they're not.
Yeah, right. So there's a clear subtext here, a clear message of order versus chaos, of progress versus in civilization versus the uncivilized savage, right? And the image here, I think, is actually I've read accounts of it on both American and Japanese accounts, and they do describe this as being an actual what happened, right? So this is a very good point, I think, that you made there.
Also, it's like the horizon, all you can see is like look at like the edge of the ocean. Like the picture is so expansive, there's like no edge. There's like our U.S. ships. That's what you see everywhere.
Yeah. So those ships are there not just to show that the U.S. could fire upon Japan, but they're also there to. I mean, so it's hard to see here. These are much bigger ships than you might. These are like 3- and 4-masted ships, so they're very big ships. But anyway, they also mark the horizon. They mark what the Japanese are able to see and the possible threat of the West, and perhaps also Japan's future. So I think I saw your hand also, Anshu.
Yeah, I was saying that, I don't know, it looks like there's like one way that really Japanese vessels, isn't it? America, like overpowering everything.
Yeah, they occupy the whole image.
The image is to show that, there's only one, like, if they use this kind of thing,
Yeah, I think very well said. Over here, all the Japanese, right? They're mostly over there, aside from the delegation, the samurai, who have come out from the shogunate to discuss what's happening. And this was a really cool moment in terms of sort of international relations, because the Japanese and Americans really do have to talk to each other. They really do communicate. And we assumed that the Japanese were sort of alone and on their own because they were isolated, but they were in fact not. They were getting things like, we know that in the 1850s, the shogunate was reading papers in English, right, from England. So they were getting stuff through Nagasaki, and they were not, totally shocked to see Westerners. But most people in Japan, the commoners, were, I think, shocked to see the Westerners who arrived looking very official in their uniforms. The delegation of Commodore Perry that came back brought lots of gifts, books, a telegraph machine, obviously some arms, clocks, potatoes, which were a new thing that they were trying to show off how cool the potatoes were. They brought whiskey, obviously, and champagne, which the Japanese liked a lot. They brought a miniature steam train. So picture this, right? You go onto the American ship, the American head ship, and you are supposed to talk about asking them to leave, if possible. And they don't want to talk about it. They want to show you what they have. They want to show you the American culture, America's progress through these kinds of gifts. So by the end of the trip on the beach, the Japanese were riding on this miniature train and having a great time. The Japanese also on their side wanted to show the U.S. how strong they were. So they didn't have a steam train. They thought about using their own cultural products. They brought out lots of geisha, but also some prostitutes. So those should be two separate bullet points. But they also did a big sumo demonstration. So they brought Edo's most famous sumo wrestlers, made the trip out to the beach, and they did a basho or a sumo tournament, and showed how they were very strong physically. The Americans were not impressed by this at all, and perhaps they should have, but they were not. And so I think this sort of shows the disparity between the American efforts to convey their strength and those of Japan. All this aside, Japan still has to make a choice, right? Are we going to let the U.S. become a trade partner? Are we going to open our ports, which have been closed for 2.5 centuries, to almost all of the West? Are we going to allow them to be open to the West or not? The shogunate has to make a decision. The chief counselor, the person who is sort of like the prime minister of the shogunate, if you will, right? The chief counselor is supposed to figure this out. and he's very aware of the texts, like the one written by Aizawa Yasushi about a weak shogunate. He's very aware of the rise of this national study of Kokugaku. He's very aware of all these things. He's aware that there are samurai who are dissident, who are unhappy with the way things are, who are watching this. So he asks in a very rare move, he asks the daimyo, what do you guys think? We're all part of the same daimyo class. We are all supporting the shogunate. I'm the chief counselor, but we're all on the same page, right? So he wanted to sort of put the buck on them and ask them, well, what do you think we should do? That didn't work. There was too much disagreement, so then he resigned. The new chief counselor has a different idea. He decides to bypass the daimyo and even the rest of the shogunate and to ask the emperor. Because if the emperor ratifies this treaty, the shogun, who is supposed to be, with the pyramid, the appointee of the emperor, is off the hook, right? But in a surprise move, Emperor Kome, who's emperor at this point in time, and who's thinking himself about the role of the emperor in Japan, whose court members, those who work around him in Kyoto, have been reading the same documents by Atsutane, by Noinaga, by Aizawa Yasushi. He asserts himself, right? He tries to affirm the emperor actually does have some power, and he refuses it. He denies this treaty ratification. And so then we're left again with another impasse. So Chief Counselor Hotta also resigns. The next Prime Minister, Chief Counselor, I should say, comes into power with a shogunate that's going to try and revive itself. It's going to try and take back power, use the situation to reassert the primacy of the shogunate. So first of all, he has the shogun sign the treaty anyway with the U.S., the U.S.-Japan Treaty of Amity and Commerce. He appoints a new shogun. I guess I should put first the shogun is appointed, then he has the shogun sign the treaty. He appoints a new 12-year-old shogun, Togawa Iemochi, and he also purges all of the reformist samurai officials. So those in the shogunate who are trying to push towards more of an open country, push towards a stronger role for the emperor in particular, are purged. There are executions, a lot of jailings. Some people are thrown into exile. So it's a moment of purge that he hoped would help turn the tide. It does not in the end, but we'll get there in a second. The treaty that the U.S. and Japan signs opens up 8 cities to trade with the United States, which is a lot. Right? Think about having just one port here, which is kind of isolated from the rest of Japan, Nagasaki, opening up 7 other ports, all the way up into Hakodate in Hokkaido, down in through Honshu as well, and these ports here in Shimoda and Kanagawa and Yokohama, Edo, all of these are very close to the capital, right, as well. So they're letting foreigners not only in Japan, but into the heart of Japan, the new heart of Tokugawa Japan. It's not a very good treaty, as you might have guessed from the Opium Wars that the British fought. The goal of imperialism was not to be equal partners. It was to have, for Western countries to have more benefit in their treaty relationships. So, for example, there was a tariff inequality in which the Japanese goods were sold with high tariffs in the United States, but American goods were sold at low tariffs in Japan, sort of guaranteeing that there would be demand for American goods in Japan. Other key element of this treaty is extraterritoriality. This is a long word that I have trouble saying, but what does it mean? What does extraterritoriality mean? You know? Tell me your name again? Henry, yeah. Yeah, exactly, right? So this term means that in these ports where foreigners are allowed to come and live in Japan and work, They're only they have to follow the laws of their own country. So, first country is the United States. So, U.S. law applies in all of these port cities. So, why does that matter? Cameron, yeah.
It's because if you have a U.S. law applying in the port cities and the port, I know they do that for U.S. military bases currently, but if they do it like this, it allows the U.S. to, if it's U.S. law, it allows them to have, like, I would say, like, super low limits and like easier amount of trade because they don't have to like pay like the dues or do the extra stuff to go into like the actual foreign country. So usually what they have to do is go foreign country.
Okay, so there's sort of this duty-free access aspect, which is true. I'm thinking about sort of legal issues. So let's say you are a Westerner in Japan. Why is that? And you commit a crime. Why is this situation of note? Why do we care that this is one of the treaty stipulations? Yeah, tell me your name. Damien, yeah. Yeah, totally, right? So this is it's a men's club, right? At this point in time, and these are all friends, right? All the foreigners live together in the same small treaty ports. So when Americans commit crimes, for the most part, they get lesser penalties, right? Or sometimes none at all. So this is obviously a slap in the face for Japan, as it was for China after the Opium Wars. So this is one of the sort of seeds of contention between the U.S. and Japan that goes will sort of fester, right? And that Japan would like to see removed. But initially, this is the treaty that Japan and the United States signed. It also includes a most favored nation clause, which basically means that any other country that agrees to trade with Japan will have the same rights. So this will include England. This will include France. Will include Russia as well. 8 other countries that will eventually become part of this treaty system, and they'll all have the same kinds of rights: the same low tariff, high tariff disparity, and the same extraterritoriality with Japan. All right, so at this point in time, we have a serious problem. We have the shogunate who has gone against the wishes of the emperor, right, clearly, and allowed Westerners to trade with Japan. We have a shogunate also that has shown itself unable to handle the Western threat in 1808, and again here in 1853, 54. So they really are unable, right, with their materials and training to handle the Western threat. And we also have a third problem, which I haven't discussed much because of time issues, but it has to do with the samurai who were part of the daimyo class, but they fought against Tokugawa Ieyasu. Because of that, he placed them in a different status. They were made into outside daimyo, daimyo whose lands were sometimes large, were far away from the capital. They don't get to serve at all in the government. So they're very unhappy with that. They have been for 2.5 centuries. So those figures, particularly looking for chances to find their own a place in perhaps a new government of Japan. The only one of these outside daimyo that finds its way to being a supporter of the shogunate is Satsuma domain originally. Yeah, Derek. A good question. The Japanese, the Westerners thought of the Japanese as backwards. Smart but backwards. And they didn't have the Americans saw the Japanese as like a project. Like we can make the Japanese better. They have potential to be, more advanced in everything that we see. The way that they treat women, the way that they build things, the way that they travel. But they saw potential among these savages. Question, Natalie?
That imperialist view of the country taking over, taking over, so one of policy or something that they want from foreigners, but then also they like kind of try to think about their
Hmm.
two states, I would say. Like if you think about why Russians would show, you know, there's like this whole thing for good. I don't know.
So you've made a lot of good points, right? So imperialism is not about hatred or oppression. It's about much more than that. It's about reform. Oftentimes it's about connection. It's about profits. It's complex, right? And we see that all those forces at work here, right? So the Japanese are seen as weaker and inferior with potential, and the Americans see themselves as having sort of they can gain a lot from this new tie, but they can also be the ones to bring Japan up, to a higher level of civilization. So this map here, I think, is relatively good to showing us that the outside domain of Satsuma is the only one of the former opponents of the shogunate when it was founded that joined the shogunate willingly. And so by the 1860s, sort of the enforcers, the strong forces among the daimyo whom the shogun calls upon to do major military things, right, to be sort of their policemen, are Satsuma here, and I guess you can't see on the map, Aizu, which is kind of, it's up here, Aizu. So back to our map, back to my previous list here. Yeah, so these two are the domains that the shogunate will look to for protection and support, and as it looks like perhaps the loyalists, the shogunate supporters, who think that the shogun made the right calls against Commodore Perry, and in trying to expel people who were too much in favor of the emperor. These two are the ones that are going to be involved in perhaps a war against those who are imperial loyalists. The loyalists are led by Choshu and Tosa domains. These are daimyo who, again, were not on the right side of the battle won by Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1600, and have been punished by being located far away and out of power. They want to get back in power, but they're using the rhetoric of imperial restoration. If the emperor is in charge, Japan will be a much better country. And by the way, we can then perhaps ourselves become part of the new government and not be left out in the cold. So that's where things are going. And I had you guys read for today a little bit. So let's talk a bit about that. So if you take out your reading questions, you have it printed out, or you can use your computer. I'm going to ask you a couple things from the questions that I had you answer about Shibagoro, remembering Aizu. Okay, I answered the first one for you, I think, pretty clearly. Who did Aizu support in the dispute between the emperor and the shogun? The shogun, right. So definitely. Number 4 is, I think this is an important historical moment that I can ask you about and I have to talk about in my slide. So the shogun, because at this point the shogun is Tokugawa Yoshinobu, who actually was of the Mito domain. They couldn't produce an heir, so in 1867 the new shogun is in fact a member of the Mito domain, right? He comes in, he joins the main line of the shogunate. What does he do that the Aizu samurai find to be courageous, that they praise? Yeah, and tell me your name? Anthony, yeah? Yeah, right. So the shogun gives the symbolic and the literal reins of power in a ceremony back to the emperor. And he goes to Kyoto, which the shogun doesn't go to Kyoto. The emperor has to come to the capital in Edo and do things. Right? They have the ceremonies there of that type. And here we see Yoshinobu traveling from Edo down to Kyoto to say, you know what? I've been reading about this Mito Gaku stuff, this Mito school stuff for a long time. The emperor should be the one in charge. I'm happy to give power of the country back to the emperor. And the Aizu samurai, how do they view this act of Yoshinobu? Was it a good thing or a bad thing? Good, yeah, it was a good thing, and they're praising him for doing that. And they're finding it to be courageous, right? Knowing that it might cost him a lot, economically, but also politically. So what happens to the followers of the shogun, who has now openly renounced his control over Japan to the emperor. What happens to those who support the shogun? Tell me your name again. Andrew. Yeah. Oh, okay. So they find it courageous because they are following a very strict sort of a hierarchical ideology in which the shogunate makes good choices and which they will abide by. And so they heard about and discussed this choice with a member of the Bakufu, the shogunate, who told them this what did happen, and they thought, okay, this is a good idea. So it really was they were convinced this was the right path.
So it's kind of like they would have been they would have thought any decision.
I think so. I mean, most likely. So what happens to the samurai of Aizu who support the shogun who is given power back? What happens to those samurai who find the shogun's return of power, the emperor, courageous? Yeah, Kendall, is your hand up?
Yeah, sort of. They're either killed or isolated.
Yeah, right. They're attacked, right? So a war actually breaks out, and the war should have stopped when the emperor took power back from the shogun, in theory, right? But the samurai fighting for the emperor, they kept fighting. They kept trying to punish those who would not officially recognize the emperor as the leader of Japan. And then once that was all done, they still kept fighting to keep punishing those who resisted this. So the samurai of Aizu, they resisted, right? They resisted, and the shogun actually, as a whole, was being dissolved. And that wasn't part of the deal. The deal was the shogun would be able to keep a title and to keep having, an important role in government, right? And the reality was that the new government was going to totally wipe out the shogunate and take away all of its privileges. And so it was sort of because of that these samurai continued to resist the new order. All right, so there was a siege of the castle. Let me ask you a question about that. The castle in Aizu called Aizu Wakamatsu. I think it's Tsugaru Castle. What courageous acts did the women of Aizu Castle do during the attack? What did they do? Yeah, and Johnny? Yeah.
Did they all kill themselves so that the samurai had like a clean conscience for fighting?
Yeah, right. So they all committed ritual suicide in order to free the men up to fight, right? Knowing that they wouldn't have to think about their families if they died, right? So that was a courageous act according to Shibagoro. Yeah, Jackie? Yeah, definitely, right? So when the cannonballs were fired by the imperial forces, by now led by Satsuma, who had changed sides, and now was fighting for the emperor and loyalists, they would avoid them exploding, or at least minimize the explosions by covering them with lots and lots of mats, straw mats. Very courageous. You just think it's like a grenade, and then you just, it's very, very